Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 180, August 26th, September 1st, 1864. Last week, we talked about two secret missions conducted on the part of the Confederacy. In one case, we have a bomb exploding at City Point. While this would do some damage, it did not really stop the logistical network coming into that key river port. We also have the CSS Tallahassee, which will raid into northern waters. Besides reminding the northern public there was still a war going on, it also was a key boost to the southern morale. Especially the Navy as well, if you think about it. Mobile has fallen, that's really the last bastion of Confederate naval strength there, so there's not really a whole lot to go off of moving forward. This week we are going to backtrack just a bit. We will head to Atlanta, cover some events we have missed, and eventually get to the fall of that key southern city. Before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about our Patreon content, and of course, we do have an episode this week, a picture slideshow of some of the smaller locations around the Richmond area that you can visit, and kind of talking through the pros and cons of going to these places. So it's really more focused on the travel aspect, I guess, or the visiting aspect. So that's a little bit different from some of the other picture slideshows that we have done. And here, as we get into September, we're going to be going over some Civil War poetry. That's going to be our new Patreon content. We're going to have some poems from individuals who either were around during the Civil War or served during the Civil War. So we're going to go over some of those. And I know way back, I think in 1862, we actually read a poem here on the narrative episodes. And we're going to get more into poetry here, talk a little bit about the influences there on some of these, read some of them. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And pretty soon we're going to be going back to movies, and also we have a picture slideshow for The Crater as well that we're going to be releasing and taking a look at that. So if any of that sounds interesting, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. When we were last in the area a few episodes ago, John Bell Hood took control of the Army of Tennessee. He would try to be aggressive, launching a series of attacks, one at Peachtree Creek, one at Bald Hill, and a third unauthorized attack at Ezra Church, although this just spoiled another authorized attack. Hood has seen little success and covered up just how poorly these assaults were when reporting back to Richmond. While there were some instances with some opportunity, overall execution was lacking. Sherman, not surprisingly, was pretty content to let Hood just smash his army against his. The attitude of the common soldiers can be highlighted in the following of one of these offensives. A Union picket would call out to the Confederates to ask how many men they still had, to which a Confederate would yell back, about enough for one or two more killings. Morale was going to be understandably low for the South. Around the same time as the infantry assaults, there would be some cavalry action that would be a positive for the rebels. Sherman, as we have talked about, would want to cut the railroad lines coming into Atlanta. That, of course, was the reason for Howard moving the Army of Tennessee out toward Ezra Church, of course sparking that action there. Sherman would find out the hard way that cavalry and cutting lines was not going to be so effective. Even when we talked about Grierson's raid that helped support the move to Vicksburg, this action really was more important for its diversion than the actual damage that was done to the Southern railroads. And this was one raid we can chalk up as one of the most daring and effective. The plan would be simple enough. George Stoneman would lead one column of around 3,000 men, and Edward McCook would lead another of around 2,100. They would converge on Lovejoy Station on the rail line into Atlanta, destroy the track there, any supplies, and then branch out to the subsequent railroad lines that spread beyond. Now, George Stoneman had sort of been on the outs since Chancellorsville, if you recall. he does not do a good job of wreaking havoc behind the Confederate lines there. Well, since he had been in Georgia, we have not really talked about him too much. Stoneman is going to want to change that and maybe get back into the good graces of the Army. If you think about it, right, there is an interesting parallel between Oliver Otis Howard, who really does get his star on the descendancy there at Chancellorsville, and it's really driven home following Gettysburg, the negative perception of the 11th Corps. And then you also have Stoneman, who's looking to be also vindicated as well. He's one of the other guys that Hooker really blames. Hooker has, his trifecta of guys that mess up Chancellorsville for him, in his book anyway, and it's going to be Howard, Stoneman, and Sedgwick. So each of these guys is going to be wanting some redemption. Once Lovejoy Station is eliminated, he would wish to move on to Macon and liberate Union officers imprisoned there. Additionally, he would want a bolder plan to liberate the prisoners at Andersonville, assuming that their previous raiding had gone well. Well, unfortunately, things are not going to go well for George. First, he does not make the planned rendezvous at Lovejoy Station. Edward McCook, with the smaller force, would make good on that target, but meanwhile, the other column to the east would make straight for Macon. Howell Cobb would be placed to block the advance of the Federal horsemen. A blockhouse would be the key to their position and not allow for the Federals to move forward. Stoneman would turn back north, but the Confederate mounted arm was not idle. Joe Wheeler had launched a pursuit of the enemy, which included Alfred Iverson riding out after Stoneman. Iverson, remember, had not done too well at Gettysburg, so he was also seeking redemption of his own. He would place his troopers defensively at a place called Sunshine Church. Stoneman, on July 31st, would attack the entrenched rebels, but the line would hold. In fact, he would grow panicked and ordered his brigades to scatter as he feared being encircled. This would only lead to Stoneman and 700 Federal cavalry to be captured, Stoneman being the highest-ranking officer to be captured for the Union during the war. Iverson reported some 250 Union casualties compared to maybe 50 on the southern side. Meanwhile, McCook had made the planned Lovejoy Station raid, causing some destruction there on July 29th. Wheeler would be on his heels, though, catching him at a place called Brown's Mill on July 30th. Now Wheeler would be joined by Philip Roddy's cavalry, which is on their way as reinforcements, these troops numbering some 600. As a result, it would appear that McCook was being surrounded. The Federals would launch furious charges, including one by Minty and the Sabre Brigade. The 8th Iowa would break through and capture some horse holders before being overwhelmed themselves. McCook would order his command to scatter, the majority being captured, numbering around 1,200. The last of the fighting McCooks in the field around Atlanta would make it back to friendly lines. The raid had been a huge failure, losing some 50% of its strength, and in the process was a big morale boost for the Confederates. For Hood, obviously some good news, and for Wheeler, who had not seen too much success in the recent campaigning, likewise, some great news. So we have Sherman decided that infantry would be the way to get at the railroads. He would start to try to extend his line south from Ezra Church in an attempt to turn the left flank of the rebels. Hood would wish to protect the railroad and extend his line to the south and west, crossing a creek called Utoy in the process. The Federals would be frustrated with the ability of the Confederates to block them. Remember that Sherman had grown used to Johnson and his constant retreating and allowing for flanking motions, so we can say Hood has the right idea. We can only imagine if Johnson is still in charge of the defenses around Atlanta, just how difficult it would be to get at the city. Although, to be honest, if you're asking me, I think Atlanta probably would have been abandoned by this point if it was Johnson at the helm, but that's just my opinion. But on the flip side, it also could have led to some direct action, right? There would have been more frustration on the part of the Federals. They had had a negative at Kennesaw Mountain, where they had seen some casualties there, but as they have their goal so close in Atlanta and actually getting to that city, I think maybe there could have been some kind of action where the Confederates were on the defensive that could have played out, as we're going to see here at Utoy Creek. Sherman would decide that Schofield and his Army of the Ohio, which had extended his line, would push straight on through to the railroad. Schofield would have operational control and issue orders to John Palmer. Palmer, however, would refuse such orders, stating that Schofield was lesser in rank than him, despite Schofield commanding an army as opposed to just a corps. Palmer would resign as a result of this. Jefferson C. Davis would take his place, rising pretty far from murdering Bull Nelson in Louisville. Schofield would have Absalom Baird's men of the 14th Corps push on to the Confederate pickets, but little else was accomplished on August 4th. Schofield would then have Cox's division, James Riley's brigade, advance out on August 5th. They would hit Bates' Confederates around Utoy Creek and sustain heavy losses. Bate would suffer very few, in fact. The following day would see a renewed effort by the 14th Corps that would capture the rebel picket line and net some 200 prisoners, but again at a very high cost. Bate would hold his new railroad line in the face of Schofield's reconnaissance. Utoy Creek was an interesting example of Sherman resorting back to frontal assaults. Now at this point in the campaign, I think we can understand at least a little of where he's coming from. The Confederates have been repulsed 3 times, so maybe their positions will be weaker. But even as far back as Chickasaw Bayou, attacking earthworks head-on has really not worked for Sherman, and neither should it be said is it working for Grant, as we have highlighted in the Overland Campaign. Grant is simply just seeing it on a much larger scale. Utoy Creek would be one of those battles that happens in between the larger ones for Grant, like say Bethesda Church, or even the North Anna, that we don't really get a whole lot of fanfare for. And there's something to be said of this being a larger scale action for the Atlanta campaign. So while Sherman is not entirely winning through maneuver alone, he is at least mitigating losses. We do a lot of comparison of Sherman and Grant for the Atlanta campaign and the Overland campaign. We've talked about it before, but obviously the situations are very different, and I think we need to point that out in that Johnson and the Army of Tennessee in the beginning of the campaign, and then Hood, that army is very, very different than the Army of Northern Virginia. And once again, we also have this emphasis on whether the goal is actually to capture the city or is the goal to eliminate the field army. And Sherman certainly doesn't have the latter of those in mind when he is conducting the Atlanta campaign. He really is just trying to get into Atlanta. That's kind of the goal. And you can see from the campaign that he acts that way, right? Whereas Grant is very much like Richmond is a secondary goal. Capturing Richmond is obviously going to be very tough for the Confederates to come back from. It is their capital after all. There's a lot of industry there for them. But he also thinks that it is very important to destroy Lee and his army. And that's going to be more the primary goal. And you have to have these frontal assaults, these head-on collisions with Lee in order to actually accomplish that task. With the repulse at Utoy Creek, Sherman was content to send shells into the city. In fact, he would call up his batteries to do that. Not much is made of the way in which he targets the civilian city, including Hood's headquarters. However, there have already been some damages done to the city, and most civilians and Confederate operations had really already left. The bombardment was to try to induce the rebels to leave. There would be examples of siege warfare, as we have seen in other places. In fact, William Bate of the Confederates and Grenville Dodge of the Federal side would be wounded, Dodge severely so during this stage of the campaign. Hood was still determined to fight. He would launch a raid with Joe Wheeler, who would take a little less than half of his cavalry force north to try to raid into the Sherman supply lines. Now this had been an idea from Joe Johnson, get Forrest over and do the very same thing. Forrest's name might have carried a little bit more weight to it, but it is hard to say whether he would have done a better job than Wheeler, who did not really accomplish a whole lot at all. His raid would begin on the 10th and get some spots of the railroad. The 14th United States Colored Troops would do good work in driving away rebel troopers at one point during the raid. Notably, Sherman does not use these troops as combat soldiers, as Grant has been doing in the main theater. By August 18th, the damage was all repaired. Judson Kilpatrick would also launch a raid, trying where McCook and Stoneman had failed. He would skirmish with Lawrence Sol Ross's cavalry, and he would be chased by Frank Armstrong. But he would accomplish very little overall. In fact, the Confederates were able to repair the damage in only 2 days. Reportedly, when Kill Cavalry showed up to talk about his triumph at Sherman's headquarters, the Army group leader could hear train whistles as the vehicles made their way into the city. Talk about your bummer situation if you are Judson Kilpatrick, talking about how you just cut the railroad and obviously the Confederates were not going to be able to repair it so easily and they weren't going to get supplies into the city. And then while you're actually telling that story, there are train whistles going on in the background. So obviously that kind of destroys your point there. In the meantime, Hood would want to call up all available troops. Any men on leave, authorized or not, or recovering wounded would be added back into the army. Additionally, some of the men in the artillery were pulled. Remember that an artillery crew had a set of numbers designated for each crew member in order to accomplish a task to fire your artillery piece. Well, Hood is actually going to remove one of these individuals, so there's going to be some double duty on the part of some of the artillerymen. A pardon for leave without permission was really telling measures, complete with press releases calling for men to return to the ranks. Additionally, Hood, of course, had the militia under Gustavus Smith, but they were not the same as combat veterans. One soldier would write of these militiamen. Some few of what soldiers call new issue joined us today. These are persons who have been called into service by recent proclamations and orders, most of them never having served in the army before. Unfortunately for them, they were marched along in a body through the camps of some of the older troops, and consequently were made the target for innumerable jests and jibes. I remember one rather delicate-looking young man who seemed to attract an unusual share of this kind of attention. He was very much more neatly dressed than his companions, and had on what was exceedingly unusual at this time, a clean shirt and a white collar. He also had a white pocket handkerchief, which would occasionally flourish as he passed along. One fellow asked him if he did not wish to trade off his old clothes when they put him in uniform. Presently, an old, dirty, ragged Tennessean hailed him with something like the following: "I say, mister, what do you think of that white rag you're toting around in your hand?" New Issue halted, and turning upon his interrogator, and with a look of fierce scorn replied, "I use this to wipe my face on. If you had it, you'd hoist it on your ramrod." The soldiers laughed, and Milish passed on without further molestation. Overall, all measures would not come too close to replenishing the ranks. Hood had lost some 10,000 men during the attacks in July, and he was not going to be able to just get them back. But this time, Lee is also scraping the bottom of the barrel, as we have highlighted there. But the main difference, I believe, is while morale is not gone from the Army of Tennessee, there was much better esprit de corps in the main theater. Sherman would in the meantime start to launch what he called the rank movement to the right. The corps would start to shift to the south. Hood would watch these moves closely in late August. What the target would be was confusing for the Confederates, the Federals able to hit the railroad while the rebels were still reacting. Eventually, the destination would be Jonesboro, some 10 miles south of the city. Once Hood realized that Howard and 2 corps from Thomas had given him the slip, he would order Hardee and S.D. Lee to Jonesboro and order them to drive away the Union troops there on the 31st. Stuart and the militia would remain in the Atlanta defenses to check the remaining troops still in opposition to him there, which included, of course, Schofield and Slocum. 2 brigades had already been sent to that railroad stop and were to hold at all hazards. The Union forces, though, had not only been able to destroy the Macon Railroad, but they were also able to dig in and prepare for a potential Confederate assault. On the 31st, the plan would be for Cleburne to wheel Hardee's corps to attack Ransom's 16th and drive them. Lee with Anderson and Stevenson hitting Logan's corps from the west. Lee, though, would jump off before the attack truly began, thinking the sound of skirmishing was his cue to jump off. Anderson and Stevenson will be repulsed by Hazen and Harrow. Kilpatrick's cavalry would actually be able to pull off part of the rebel attacking force, Claiborne forced to check them as they were armed with Spencer repeaters and threatening his flank. This meant that only Brown would attack the line of Ransom. These troops would be hit with such a tremendous fire that some would go to cover and refuse to move forward once there. In all, the attacks were ill-advised, only racking up additional Confederate losses. For less than 100 Federals, 1,700 Confederates would become casualties. Howard would write to Sherman that they had been handsomely repulsed. Absalom Baird's men, in the meantime, had reached the railroad north of Jonesboro. Hood had anticipated having to move and ordered his forces to be ready to pull out. Supplies would be distributed, but otherwise they would be destroyed, the city gearing up for the Confederate abandonment. Stanley's 4th Corps and the 14th under Davis would advance down the railroad following additional destruction on September 1st. They would throw their weight on the Confederates, particularly Govan's brigade, which would suffer 900 captured. The rebel defense would break, with 1,200 Union casualties and another 1,400 on the side of the South. This action would mark the end of the Atlanta campaign. Hood would evacuate, pulling the army to safety. Now Sherman is criticized that he did not finish off Hardee and then the rest of the rebels, but with Atlanta in his grasp, it seemed irrelevant. "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," he would report to Halleck. Now, this does go back to my point before in that Sherman is not really interested necessarily in the destruction of the field army. He is interested in capturing Atlanta. So while he actually probably does have a great opportunity to destroy the Confederate army in detail, right? Hardee is separated from the main Confederate forces, as is S.D. Lee, and then Hood only has A.P. Stewart and the militia in the north. So he would have been able to maybe have, once again, destroyed the Confederate army here, and then there really wouldn't have been too much more to do here except start marching north, right, to join Grant and the siege of Petersburg and finish off Lee. However, again, the goal is to get to Atlanta. He gets Atlanta. There's not really a whole lot of strategic value to Atlanta, but it is very symbolic and has value there, has value toward the election, has value toward the morale of the Confederates as it continues to plummet, them seeing another city fall into federal hands. We can also think about it too in this way, in that even though these are not the same numbers that the East is seeing in these battles, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, right, Petersburg assaults, they're not seeing the same numbers, but Sherman does see Kennesaw Mountain. He sees that as a huge failure, and his men suffer pretty heavy casualties there. And then he also sees, on the flip side, Hood launching these ill-advised attacks, and he's suffering heavy casualties. So you can probably understand why he's like, all right, Atlanta is ours. Let's just go ahead and keep it. And then Hood can go ahead and retreat. And he's probably going to give up soon anyway. So that's definitely Sherman's attitude in that, why aren't these people giving up? Why aren't they surrendering? And then he turns to a little bit of a harder war as he has this idea, I'm going to have to march to the sea. And we'll get into that, of course, in a future episode. Federals would enter the city triumphantly on September 2nd. Henry Slocum would get the honor. Sherman would issue Order 64 on the 2nd. Special Field Orders number 64 in the field near Lovejoy's, September 4th, 1864. The Army, having accomplished its undertaking in the complete reduction and occupation of Atlanta, will occupy the place and the country near it until a new campaign is planned in concert with the other grand armies of the United States. 1. The Army of the Cumberland will occupy the city and its communications with Chattanooga. The Army of Tennessee will occupy East Point and the right flank, and the Army of Ohio, the town of Decatur, and the left flank. The cavalry will occupy Sandstown, Roswell, and other points on the flanks and along our lines of communication. 2. To withdraw to the posts herein designated, the Army of the Cumberland will withdraw, first to Jonesboro, second to Rough and Ready, and third to Atlanta, leaving the cavalry to bring up the rear in the manner herein prescribed. 3. The Army of Tennessee will move in concert with that of the Cumberland, first to its old position near Jonesboro, second across the Flint River to about Murrow's Mill, and third to East Point and the head of Camp Creek. 4. The Army of Ohio will move in concert with that of Cumberland, first to a point near Jonesboro, second to some point within 2 miles and east of Rough and Ready, and last to Decatur. 5. General Kilpatrick's cavalry will cover the left rear of the Army of Tennessee and that of General Garrard, the right rear of the Army of Ohio, until they reach the positions assigned in this order, when the cavalry commands were moved to the points designated via Sandtown and Roswell. 6. The General Chief will give notice when the movement will begin, and after reaching Atlanta, will establish headquarters in Atlanta, and afford the Army an opportunity to have a full month's rest, with every chance to organize, receive pay, replenish clothing, and prepare for a fine winter campaign. By order of Major General William T. Sherman. So we need to take a look at what Sherman accomplishes in his conquest of Atlanta. His campaign is very different than Grant's, as we have highlighted. I think we can say that while troop strengths are comparable, Sherman never has the truly large-scale operations that Grant and Meade are having in Virginia. Likewise, he is focusing on maneuver, although Grant too is shifting the army to better get at Lee. So it's really unfair to say that Grant is without maneuver. He is just maneuvering, but also engaging in these battles in which he could try to destroy the army of Northern Virginia. And we know that during the Civil War, it's extremely hard to destroy an army. It's not like Napoleon, and the destruction of armies in the Napoleonic War seems to happen all the time. Well, Richmond and Petersburg remain in Confederate hands, and Atlanta is now in the hands of the Union, and this will be a big win for Lincoln and his re-election bid. Remember, is really a what have you done for me lately scenario, so Atlanta would be a big prize toward that effort. Whether Atlanta really does net Lincoln the presidency is up for debate, but I would throw out that it does not hurt. Because supplies, along with any kind of tools for industry, have either been removed or destroyed, you really only have that post to lean on. Otherwise, Atlanta is really just another city. Sherman will pause and get a well-deserved rest. Soon enough, though, we will need to head back to this region. As he alluded to in his orders here, Sherman is not done terrorizing Georgia. He's going to launch a winter campaign that's actually going to be one of the more famous events associated with him and his history and the Civil War in general. With that, we will pause. Atlanta has finally fallen. We will see what happens to Hood and Sherman in a future episode, as rest assured, both are not done yet with our story. Next week, we will head to check in on some cavalry actions. We need to launch the Beefsteak Raid, and we need to say goodbye to John Hunt Morgan. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.